Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every week, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me, and most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. This episode is part of the California Leadership Series, where we focus on changemakers in California government who are shaping the most innovative energy and climate policy anywhere, transforming the world's fifth largest economy and beyond. Our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series is Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. Lyft is preferred by drivers and passengers for its reliable and friendly experience and its commitment to effecting positive change for the future of our cities as the first rideshare company to launch a carbon offset program. And now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. On this, our maiden episode of the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, we kick off a roughly 12-episode focus on California's emergence as a climate and clean energy powerhouse, not just within the United States, but on the global stage. And who better to kick off this series than Matt Rodriquez, Secretary of California's Environmental Protection Agency. Secretary Rodriquez was appointed to this role in mid-2011 by Governor Jerry Brown after serving as a Deputy Attorney General in California for a dozen years, where he oversaw a range of land, coastal, development, and conservation issues. As Secretary, Rodriquez oversees the full suite of environmental agencies, including the California Air Resources Board, the Water Boards, the Toxic Substances Control Board, and pesticide regulation. He's Governor Brown's chief environmental advisor and has been instrumental not only in developing California's response to climate change, but also in working with other states and countries around the world to increase climate action. I got to know Matt when I was with the Climate Registry on trips to UN climate conferences in Lima, Paris, and Marrakesh, and I appreciate not only his acumen and vision, but also his dry wit. I think you'll enjoy this far-ranging conversation about Matt's childhood, his career path, and his advice to those trying to make a positive impact on the environment. Well, Secretary Rodriquez, thanks so much for joining the podcast. Mm-hmm. I appreciate your time. I'd like to start out by talking about your earlier part of life and what drove you to this work. I know that you grew up about 70 miles southwest of here in Hayward. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about what it was like to grow up there before the sprawl set in to the extent that it is now.
Well, first, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. I appreciate it. We'll find out whether there's all that much I have that's worthy to say, but I look forward to the conversation. Talking to you did get me started thinking about what it was like growing up in Hayward when I was a kid, and how did I wind up in this line of work. You have to look back and think about the fact that I was growing up in Hayward in the 60s. And it was quite a tumultuous time. And there were questions, I think, about some of the decisions that our government was making. And I think my mother in particular had encouraged me to think about government and the decisions that government makes. So I was interested by things like the oil spill in Santa Barbara in the 60s, or the discussion that was going on, not only about the war, but the use of Agent Orange and defoliants got us thinking about what we were doing to the environment. Additionally, I grew up in cities. We talked about, my family and what we did for recreation. And actually, our recreation was centered on cities. If we needed to sort of download or get away from life, what we'd do is go to bookstores or go to record stores and do things like that. And the 60s and the 70s were a tough time for cities. You saw a lot of people leaving cities. You saw businesses shutting down in those cities. You saw flight to the suburbs, and I always thought that was a bad thing. I liked cities. I liked vibrant cities. I loved to see what's going on in Oakland and in particular right now, but to see the revitalization of our cities is a good thing. So I saw what it was like to live in the suburbs and see the orchards that had been around the city being plowed under. I thought that was sort of too bad as well, particularly when it was indicative of the fact that people were leaving the cities and going out to the suburbs. So there were a lot of factors, I think, that motivated me as a young person to think about how government was making decisions, how decisions were being made that affected our environment. Probably too long of an answer, but it was a variety of things that affected me.
But it wasn't your first course, at least academically. You studied history, as I understand it.
That's right. While I was interested in government and government decision making, my major was history. I did enjoy political science courses, and so that was of interest to me. But I went to a 40-year high school reunion a while ago, and I was reminded of the fact that when I was a kid, I told people I was either going to be a politician or an attorney. So while I enjoyed history, there was always apparently that idea in my mind that I would go into government in some form or be an attorney. And so I went into the legal profession, still not absolutely sure what I wanted to do. But it seemed like a place where I could make a difference. So I went to law school and wound up here.
And in between, I know that you studied environmental law or maybe first took an environmental law class that interested you. Talk about that experience.
Yeah, as we've talked about, when I went to law school, even though I said I wanted to be an attorney as I was growing up, I don't think we knew any attorneys in the family. And so I wasn't too sure after my first year that I really wanted to continue with law school, but decided I'd done well enough given my level of interest that I'd go back for a second year and see if I could find something that interested me. And I will say that the law is a profession that if you don't find something you're passionate about, it can really grind you down. And so I was looking for something that I really felt strongly about. And I took two courses, one on environmental law and one on land use law. And both of those really resonated. All of a sudden I got much better grades than I'd been getting before, and a part of that was something in those courses appealed to me. And I still, remember those courses fondly. And they got me started on the direction that I eventually wound up following. Why did I like them so much? They were tangible. My poor girlfriend, who is now my wife, had to listen to me say, "Oh, hold it! As we're driving down the street, you can see now the zoning's changed in this area." I started to take much more interest in some of the decisions that were being made. For example, some of the developmental decisions that were affecting the coast, and so it just was an area of the law that appealed to me because it was so real and it affected so many people. And it seemed like an interesting place to work.
Were you ever drawn or interested in private practice, or was it pretty clear that you wanted to work on issues of public import? Was it really a conscious decision that I wasn't going to go into private practice? No, but I was drawn to the governmental work, and it just turned out that the first job that I got was with a state agency, and so that sort of set me off on a path. And I just never had real second thoughts about it all along. So I've enjoyed what I've done. So sometimes I think about maybe I should have tried private practice for a while, but as I said, I've enjoyed what I've done. Yeah. So after that first foray into a state agency, which I believe was OPR, is that right?
Actually, I worked for the Coastal Commission first, and again, that's just sort of happenstance. I'd done well enough in my land use and environmental classes that enabled me to get a job with the Coastal Commission. And even though I didn't have a background in planning, and even though I was hired to do some rudimentary legal work, I got thrown into doing planning. Doing staff reports for what was then a regional coastal commission, doing some of the groundwork of a staff person, trying to develop conditions that would be applied to development, focused mostly on Marin and Sonoma County, and that enabled me to take a look at some of the issues concerning public access and allowing the public to get to the coast or at least see the coast. Some of the infrastructure restraints on development in those areas. So it was a great education as well as an interesting job. So that got me started. And then from there, I went to OPR and did work again on land use issues and that sort of thing.
So how then did you find your entry into city government?
Governor Brown left office and Governor Deukmejian came into office, and there was a change at OPR as a result. And so I finally needed to settle down and get a real legal job and see what it was like to be an attorney. Working for city government seemed like an interesting educational experience. And as I said, I think not only did I need a job, but I had a 3-month-old son at home. And so I was fortunate to get a job in the city of Livermore, which was a very good educational experience for me. I got to see municipal law and how it works in a variety of areas. So I did a little personnel work. We did some tax work. We did infrastructure financing work. I also advised the Planning Commission while I was there, so I got to do the land use law that I enjoyed most. So it was a good education.
And you ended up in Hayward as well, right?
I went back to Hayward, and again, it was a small office, so you wind up doing a variety of things while you were there. I was fortunate to work with good attorneys both in Livermore and in Hayward. I advised a rent review panel in Hayward, picked up some good pointers on administrative law. How do you create a quasi-judicial process for making decisions? It was a good experience, but my mother, who had been active in Hayward politics for a while, decided that she was thinking of going to the city council, and there probably wasn't going to be room for both of us, both in the city. And I was fortunate to get the job with the Attorney General's office.
And from the beginning, you were, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were working on the environmental portfolio in the AG's office. Is that right, or did you have different jobs leading up to that?
I was very fortunate. One of our attorneys when I was working at the Regional Coastal Commission was Mark Mahaly. When I went to the city of Livermore, we got involved in some environmental litigation, and we hired outside counsel to work with at that time, and we hired Mark Weinberger from Shoup Mahaly and Weinberger. And Mark introduced me to some people at the state bar, including Teddy Berger, who was then the head of the environment section in the Attorney General's office. So through those connections, and given my background and having worked with the Coastal Commission, I got recruited into the land law section of the Attorney General's office, where I wound up representing the Coastal Commission, for whom I had worked as a legal assistant when I was in law school, as well as the Bay Conservation and Development Commission and the State Lands Commission.
So how far back does the state's focus on climate, specifically within the environmental portfolio, go? You mentioned a lot of work on issues of coast, of conservation, of land use. At what point did the awareness of climate change start to manifest?
Well, for me, it starts in the early 2000s. I think it started for others before then. But for me, we'd been doing an awful lot of litigation for the Coastal Commission. We'd been talking about the prospects for sea level rise during the 90s. In 1999, I think, I became the head of the land law section, which brought me in more day-to-day contact with the environment law section of the office. And they were working on climate issues, starting to work on climate issues. So it's in that early 2000 area that I start working on climate work. And then when I become the head of the Public Rights Division, certainly in 2009, by then I'm pretty well aware of some of the climate work that has been going on. And I'm doing an awful lot of work with the other sections in the office that are focused on climate issues.
Okay. So how did you get from the AG's office to this role as Secretary of Environment in California?
Good question. In the Attorney General's office, my role as the Chief of the Public Rights Division was to take issues up to the Attorney General and ask him to make decisions on things like settling cases or bringing cases against local governments. And in the Public Rights Division, it was the three sections of the office that did climate or environmental work, as well as consumer, antitrust, Indian and gaming law, civil rights. So a wide variety of work came out of that division. Over 1,100 attorneys in the office. So and within my section, there were about 200. So you were taking a lot of items up to the Attorney General. And so my role was to say, here's what we want to do. Here's why we want to do it, and explain in as concise a way as possible our rationale for why we wanted to take the actions we were recommending. That's where I got to know the governor, who was then Attorney General, and I'd like to think that he developed some confidence in our decision-making and my ability to explain why it was we were making the recommendations that we did. I see a large part of my job here as the secretary is doing the same sort of thing and having the same sort of relationship with the governor. Here's what a board or department or office within Cal EPA, here's what they want to do. Here's why we want to do it. Here's what we've looked at in coming to our decision. So it really was a continuation, I think, of the role that we developed when I was in the Attorney General's office.
When you started the job, was environment and most specifically climate as important to Governor Brown as it is today?
Climate was important to the governor when he was Attorney General, so we knew that was going to be a large part of the job, and really getting these climate programs into the implementation phase was going to be a large part of the job when I became secretary. So it was always clear to me that was going to be a focus.
Can you describe kind of the taxonomy of Cal EPA and the many different functions it serves, the different departments that fall under its umbrella?
After 7 years here, I hope I can. It really has a broad range of work. We've got the Air Resources Board. We have the State Water Resources Control Board and the 9 regional boards that work under the supervision of the state board. There's the Department of Toxic Substances Control, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments. And then within my first year here as the secretary, we brought Cal Recycle over from the Natural Resources Agency into the agency here because they do so much work with the Air Board, with DTSC, it seemed to make more sense for them to be over in this agency. So it's a wide range of work. When I started, I remember my interview with the governor. We talked about getting the Safer Consumer Products program started within DTSC. We had discussions of Prop 65 and the implementation of Prop 65 by OEHA. We talked about some of the pesticide issues that were confronting the Department of Pesticide Regulation. We, of course, discussed all the climate issues and what was going on with climate, in particular, getting the cap and trade program going. But it was a wide range of issues. And then once you get here, you find out that the issues are even broader than that. And so within my first year or two here, we started looking at drinking water issues in California and looking at the fact we needed to do more to make sure that all Californians had access to safe drinking water. So there are a large number of issues that come up on a day-to-day basis, and it's not just climate; it's all these other programs as well.
Do you have a sense of the total jobs impact that these agencies and departments employ?
By jobs impacts, you mean
how many? What is the staff size?
The staff size, we've got 5,700 employees, more or less, or at least that's how many positions we have within the agency, and there are offices in Southern California, in the Bay Area, and here as well. But there is an effort to concentrate the work of the office here in this one building in Sacramento. You get a lot more done when you see people in the hallway or when you see people in the elevator, and so it makes some sense to have us all in one building to the extent that can be accomplished.
So as we've discussed, one of the intentions of this podcast is to talk about careers in sustainability. Your own path is perhaps a bit circuitous, or it gives hope to the liberal arts majors out there. I imagine that in this building and in the departments and agencies that you just described, there are a lot of scientists, a lot of engineers. Can you describe, obviously we don't have to cover everything, but sort of the range of skills and how people are hired in to these agencies?
Yeah, I was thinking about my own hiring experience. It's so old, I don't know that it's relevant anymore. And yet, starting off as a student and getting your foot in the door in some capacity, either through a fellowship program or as I was a graduate legal assistant, I think. Or if you look at my assistant, Chona. Chona was an assistant doing essentially secretarial type of work, but was getting her MBA at the same time. She's now my special assistant and is doing policy work for me and working on the climate summit. So it really is get your foot in the door. And as my career path demonstrates, then you can never really tell where that may take you. I think working as a legal assistant with the Coastal Commission when I was younger and just in the beginning of my career, as I said, gave me a good background of what it's like to be a planner. I think that helped me when I was an attorney, then advising the commission staff. I've been in your position. I know what it's like to write that staff report late at night and think about what you're going to say to the commissioners. I became known to people both within the agency and then also in Sacramento, and that helped me get jobs in the future. So it really is a question of just getting started and getting experience in an area. I think for the first 4 or 5 years, you can play around a little bit, or at least I think that's still the case. It's just good to get experience. As I said, having worked in local government was helpful as well. It helped to remind me of the local government perspective on state programs and state policies, as well as giving me background in some of those other areas for which you don't always get training. or at least focus training as you're become an administrator in personnel matters or in budget matters and things like that.
And now, a word from our sponsor. A special thanks to our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series, Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the U.S. and is available to 95% of the U.S. population. And now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. This means that a decision to ride with Lyft is a decision to take a cleaner option, cleaner than driving yourself or riding with another company, and will fund efforts that are reducing emissions and combating climate change. This is a multi-million-dollar investment in the first year alone, which makes Lyft one of the top voluntary purchasers of carbon offsets in the world. In year one, Lyft anticipates offsetting over 1 million tons of carbon, equivalent to planting tens of millions of trees or taking hundreds of thousands of cars off the road. Lyft's investment and impact will continue to grow as the company does. Ride Lyft and join together in effecting positive change for the future of our cities. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. So switching gears for 1 second to some of the work that you and I had touch points on, and that is California's leadership on the global stage, particularly when it comes to climate policy. The state of California has really moved into this position where it is a global leader. And part of that, I think, is because of its internal legislation and policies and work that it's done within the state. Part of it is the shifting dynamic in the United States vis-a-vis the federal government and work that other states are doing. But it's a pretty unique role, I think, for a state to play. Could you talk a little bit about how that role has emerged over the last few years?
I can speak to my experience. I know that I think under the previous administration and Governor Schwarzenegger, California was playing a role on the international stage and certainly played a role in, for example, the Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen. And so California's programs were well known. But when I got here, there was attention given to California in the programs, but it was difficult to get certainly the UN or other national governments to focus on what we were doing. That's developed over time, but the story I tell is about being at the Conference of the Parties in Warsaw in 2013. The California delegation then was 3 people with a law student, and we sort of operated on the periphery, and there was some interest in what was going on in California, but not a great deal of attention. You contrast that with just 2 years later, and the attention that was given to Governor Brown and California's programs at the Paris Conference of the Parties. Why that change? Well, I think that in the interim, California's programs had really started to take off. And so we could show that we were making that transition to renewable energy. We'd started a cap and trade program cooperatively with Quebec. We were demonstrating energy efficiency programs and how they can work. We were really looking at sustainable communities development. And so you could see how these programs were actually being implemented at the same time that the California economy had corrected itself. And under the governor's leadership, we were going from a significant deficit to having a positive economic outlook and, in fact, developing a surplus. And so there was a good story here on what was going on in California that I think captured the imagination of governments at both the regional and national level around the world. And I think that's what helped it to take off. But, the way you get attention is by being successful. And we've been very successful, and the governor's been very successful in California in the development of these programs. And at the same time, there's been, I think, a growing recognition that something needs to be done. I mean, you continue to see hotter years. You can continue to see more variable climate in a sense. And by that, I mean greater variations in extreme events in climate, longer droughts, more severe storms. And so I think there's been a realization that climate change is, in fact, a real problem for us. So where are we going to turn for examples on how you deal with those problems? Well, California is in the right place at the right time. And we've also shown a willingness to sit down and work with other governments around the world and organizations around the world to talk about our programs and learn from those other programs as well. So I think we've had the right attitude. This is an international problem that we all need to work on cooperatively. So how can we do that? And you see that really in the Under 2 coalition that was developed, a recognition that not only was California working on these programs, but there were similar programs in Europe. The Chinese were really intent on reducing carbon emissions in China. There was interest in developing countries on trying to find a way to provide energy efficiently. So how can we work with all these government entities? So it's a combination of hard work, success, and also being in the right place at the right time.
So given these shifting states of progress, are you optimistic?
There's no doubt it's a daunting task. There's a lot that needs to be done. If you talk about the fact that our 2020 target was to be at around 430 million metric tons of CO2 emissions, and our 2030 target is to somehow get down to 260, and then our announced target at this point for 2050 is to get down to 80 or below. You're talking about significant changes in the way we operate on a day-to-day basis. So that's a real challenge. But I think we've been able to demonstrate that where there's a challenge, we find a way to deal with it. I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy, but I am optimistic that we'll get where we need to be.
Where are the biggest areas of challenge / opportunity in that race to get to 80 million metric tons by 2050?
Well, there are challenges at a number of levels. First, we've developed great partnerships around the world, but we need to continue to work on those partnerships. And we're frequently reminded that California is not in this by itself, and so we need to work with others in order to deal with international climate change problems. In that regard, it would be especially nice if we had a federal government that wanted to work with us. So we've got to work to enlist more partners around the world. We've been fortunate to find the ones that we do have, and as I said, in Europe and in Quebec and in Canada generally, but we need more partners. And then we need to bring about some fundamental changes in our day-to-day lives. Most particularly, we've got to do something with the transportation sector. We can't do anything with climate change if we don't change the fuel sources for our transportation sector. As you know, in California, that's 40 to 50% of the emissions, 50% if you include all that goes into producing the fuel that we use in our vehicles and our transportation system. So that's going to take some fundamental changes. We also need to develop a greater understanding of forests and how can we better manage our forests so that we don't have these devastating fires. I think we need to understand more about our natural and working lands. And what can we do to both promote agriculture and make sure it's sustainable in California, but do so in a way that sequesters carbon, or at least has carbon as part of the one of the elements we're thinking about as we're going ahead with agriculture. So there are areas that we don't understand as well as our stationary source emissions and our transportation emissions. But transportation's the biggest area that we're going to need to deal with.
Are you confident in California's ability to fend off the Trump administration's desire to weaken and roll back vehicle emission standards?
Yeah, I'm smiling, which people can't see if they're listening to this. But
I'm sure you're asked this just morning, noon, and night. But
I've been a litigator for the last almost 40 years. And I think I have a pretty good assessment of what our chances are in litigation, and I'm confident that we'll be able to go ahead and continue to do what California needs to do with its programs to respond to the climate challenge and reduce emissions and change the transportation sector. So, a long-winded way of saying I'm not all that concerned about litigation with the Trump administration, particularly since litigation usually plays itself out over a long period of time, and I have some questions about how long the Trump administration will be in a position of authority. So I think there are a couple of reasons to be hopeful about how this litigation is going to work out.
So shifting back to career, and specifically your career, the work that you've done here at Cal EPA and in the AG's office, what had been most challenging, or can you point to a particular challenge or setback that you were able to overcome or not, just as a means to kind of instruct other people who obviously we all face hurdles in our careers?
I will say that there was a period in the 90s and the early 2000s when I was advising the Coastal Commission or working with them, and we had some challenging litigation. I remember there was a period of time when we had lost 4 or 5 cases in the trial court, lost a couple of cases in the Court of Appeal, and yet we didn't panic. We all thought, okay, so how do we need to fine-tune our strategy? How do we need to think about our arguments? And I forget how many millions of dollars we would have owed if we'd lost these cases in the late 90s. But we won at the Court of Appeal. We took a couple of cases up to the California Supreme Court, and prevailed in those cases. We avoided the U.S. Supreme Court. And so I've seen some difficult days in litigation when it looked fairly bleak. I will also say we had some periods of time when there were some changes in the composition of the Coastal Commission itself that made it a little bit challenging to continue with litigation when the commission had changed. But we were always able to convince them to go along and trust us with litigation. And in cases like the Marine Forest Society, which had to do with the composition of the Coastal Commission, or in Landgate versus California Coastal Commission, we were able to prevail. And then I'll also say, I have been doing this for a long time. I remember concerns about federal funding for environmental programs during the Reagan administration during the 80s. And, was this going to mean the death of some of the state programs? We were able to prevail there too. People have asked me, for example, how concerned I am about recent proposals to promote offshore oil drilling. I said, well, I've been dealing with that issue for almost my entire career, and there haven't been a large number of new derricks going off the coast of California, so it's not always easy, but we've been on a good path in California for the last 40 years. And even though there have been some difficult times, both personally in litigation or for some of the programs I advised, we've found a way to move ahead. And so I continue to be optimistic about our ability to go ahead.
I think it's important that's an important perspective of the long view, and that these things evolve over time. I know it's pressurized to do environmental work. There's a high sense of urgency that one has, and that can also lead to burnout and to kind of putting maybe too much emotion on the table. So I think that's an important perspective to say, okay, these things actually do improve over time, and there is some resiliency to the institutions that we've built around protecting the environment.
No, I think that's right. I mean, there were times in a couple of these cases where an entire program seemed in jeopardy, either because of the direction that the law appeared to be taking or because we were going to owe millions of dollars in damages, and what was the willingness of the legislature to continue to fund a program that had been found to, violate the law. In each one of those cases, there were some long nights, but we were able to figure a path forward and respond to the criticisms of the program and keep them going. And so, yeah, it can be pressure filled, but we've always found a way to move ahead. And in that regard, I will say that one of the joys of this job has always been the people that I've been able to work with. I've been able to work with some incredible people through the years who are very inspirational, very, very talented, many of them more talented than me. And that sense of common purpose keeps you going as well. So that's been an important part of my career path as well.
This is something that is intriguing to me, and I think foreign to a lot of people that are in the private sector looking in on government and trying to understand, okay, why do these people work for less in organizations that are subject to political changes? But what I've learned is that people are dedicated to public service and also dedicated to specific issues that they're working on. In this case, the environment. Is that implicit, or is that something that culturally, running this large organization, that you can make explicit ties to in terms of drawing out those passions in the culture here, in the work culture?
I think that people are attracted to public service because they do want to make a difference, because they do, which is not to say you don't make a difference clearly in the private sector, but it is an opportunity to try and improve, I think, the environment, try and address some of the issues you see in society. And so there is a strong motivation to help. And so I think that's what brings a lot of people into the job. Then as managers, our role is to really find the right fit, to find the skill sets, to find the right people to work with on or work on a particular issue. We talked earlier about the scientists and the engineers. You need good attorneys. You need good communications people to explain why it is we're doing what we're doing. So it takes a group to get this work done, but you've got a large number of people who are interested in the work, find it personally rewarding. As I said, as I started out saying, it's often quite tangible. You can see the results of your work. ARB's got to take incredible pride in the fact that, pollution over the last 40 years has been significantly reduced. There's an awful lot more we need to do, obviously, but when you can point to things like that and say that, water quality has improved, when we deal with the drinking water issues, when we can say, look, every Californian has a safe source of drinking water, those are accomplishments you can feel proud of. And so it's a combination of, I think, wanting to serve the public and make the world a better place, and then recognizing that there are a lot of ways to do that. And as I said, the manager's job is to try and bring all those skills together and all those talents together and make them all work collaboratively with one another. So as I said, I've been very fortunate through the years, both here at the agency and at the Attorney General's office, to work with some wonderful people.
So in the few months that remain in this administration, I know that you have the Governor's Climate Summit coming up in San Francisco. What loose ends or additional milestones are you moving towards in the final months of your post?
Well, the Climate Summit, as you mentioned, is important. We also need to make sure that the climate program generally continues to move ahead. The legislature last year in AB 398 and in AB 617 gave some direction to ARB on both how to fine-tune some of our climate programs, particularly the cap and trade program, and also how we should be doing more to affect the environment in some of our disadvantaged communities in California. We just need to do more on environmental justice issues in California. So you will see us working hard to implement that direction from the legislature in the remainder of this year. There is more that we want to do to improve water resiliency in California, by which I mean making sure that we're getting drinking water to everybody in the state, doing more to understand and conserve our water resources. So some very important legislation just went through on water conservation. And so we want to continue to work in those areas. I continue to want to work on CalEnviroscreen, which is our tool for identifying disadvantaged communities in California, and make sure that work continues. That's one of those things that you want to do to make sure not only that we've finished up our work on it during this administration's term, but also make sure that it's work that continues into future administrations. There are a number of issues we need to deal with, both in the Department of Toxic Substances Control in terms of individual projects that we need to work on, such as the Exide cleanup, which we just need to expedite and work in the Exide, the community around the Exide facility. There are a number of individual chemicals that we need to be taking a look at in a number of our programs, be in the drinking water program or at the Department of Pesticide Regulation or at DTSC. So there's an awful lot that still needs to be done. I haven't been in this kind of situation before where I'm at the end of a specific term. But I can tell you that we're not going to glide to the end of this year. There's an awful lot that we want to get done. And so I probably should be getting back to the office so I can do it.
Well, before I let you go, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, and maybe you're not thinking about it too much yet, but what is next for Matt Rodriguez?
I don't know. I'm going to turn 65 in a couple of weeks, and so I'm going to go off to the coast and watch the ocean for a couple of days and think about that. I don't feel like I'm ready to retire. This has been an incredible opportunity, and I don't think that I'll ever have an opportunity quite like this again. But I'd like to continue working in the environmental area, and there are many, many programs that are of interest to me. So we'll see if I can find a role after being the secretary.
I'm sure that won't be too difficult. And the environment needs you. And I want to thank you for your time today. And thanks for a career of really important work.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks again to the Sustainable Business Partner for the California Leadership Series, LIFT. To learn more about LIFT's carbon neutral program, visit lift.com/carbon. The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanke. Theme music is also by Ian Swanke. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or your preferred platform. And be sure to tell your friends and colleagues who want to make a difference. Thanks for listening. See you next week.